Welcome to Champion Stories. If this is your first time here, subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And now, on to today's story. The arena fell into an eerie silence as the final bell echoed through the massive venue, marking the end of what would become one of the most emotionally charged moments in boxing history. Manny Pacquiao stood in the center of the ring, his gloves still raised in victory, but something was different about this celebration. The usual explosive joy that followed his triumphs was replaced by an overwhelming wave of emotion that seemed to crash over him like a tsunami, threatening to sweep away the composed fighter that millions of fans had come to know and admire. The scorecards had been read, the decision announced, and the 70th victory of his professional career was now officially recorded in the history books. It was a milestone that few fighters in the sport's long and storied history had ever achieved, a testament to longevity, skill, and an unwavering dedication to the craft of boxing that had defined his life for more than 2 decades. Yet as the referee raised his hand in victory, Manny felt something breaking inside him, not from defeat or disappointment, but from the sheer weight of everything this moment represented. The crowd's roar seemed to fade into background noise as Manny's mind began racing through the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. He thought about the young boy from General Santos City who had first stepped into a boxing gym with nothing but raw hunger and an impossible dream. That child could never have imagined standing here, in this moment, having achieved something that transcended sports and entered the realm of legend. The distance between that poverty-stricken youth and this accomplished champion felt both infinite and instantaneous. As photographers and cameramen swarmed the ring, capturing every angle of his historic victory, Manny felt his composure beginning to crack. The emotions he had kept carefully controlled throughout his career, the sacrifices, the pain, the loneliness, the pressure, the responsibility he carried for his family and his country, all began to surface at once. His breathing became irregular, and he could feel tears forming in his eyes, despite his desperate attempts to maintain the stoic demeanor expected of a champion. The significance of reaching 70 professional victories was not lost on him. This wasn't just a number, it was a representation of countless hours in training camps, thousands of rounds sparred, millions of punches thrown, and decades of his life dedicated to perfecting an art form that had given him everything while simultaneously demanding everything in return. Each victory represented not just a single fight, but months of preparation, sacrifice, and unwavering focus that had shaped every aspect of his existence. Manny's team began entering the ring to celebrate with him, but he found himself stepping backward, creating space between himself and the approaching crowd. The weight of expectation, the burden of being a symbol for his entire nation, and the realization of how much of his life had been consumed by this pursuit suddenly felt overwhelming. He had spent so many years being strong for others, for his family, for his fans, for the Philippines, that he had rarely allowed himself to process the emotional toll of his extraordinary journey. The arena lights seemed brighter than usual, casting harsh shadows that made everything feel surreal and dreamlike. Manny could see the faces in the crowd, thousands of people who had traveled from around the world to witness this historic moment, and he felt the crushing responsibility of their expectations and dreams. For so many people, his success represented hope, inspiration, and proof that impossible dreams could become reality through dedication and perseverance. As the post-fight interview setup began taking shape in the center of the ring, Manny knew that in just a few minutes, he would be expected to speak to the world about this achievement. Microphones would be thrust in front of him, cameras would capture his every expression, and millions of people would be waiting to hear his thoughts on reaching this incredible milestone. But for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure he could find the words to express what he was feeling, or if he could even maintain his composure long enough to deliver them. The moment was approaching, when everything he had kept buried would finally surface. The interview platform was being assembled in the center of the ring with mechanical precision, each piece of equipment positioned to capture what the broadcasting networks expected would be a standard post-fight celebration. Technicians adjusted lighting rigs while sound engineers tested microphone levels, all preparing for what they assumed would be another routine victory interview with the legendary fighter. None of them could have anticipated that they were about to witness one of the most raw and vulnerable moments in sports history. Manny stood at the edge of the ring, watching the preparations with a growing sense of unease. His hands, still wrapped in boxing tape, trembled slightly as the adrenaline from the fight began to subside and was replaced by an emotional intensity he had never experienced before. The physical exhaustion from 12 rounds of elite-level boxing paled in comparison to the psychological weight that was settling over him like a heavy blanket. The magnitude of 70 professional victories was beginning to sink in on a deeper level. This wasn't just a career milestone. It was a testament to a life lived entirely in service to a sport that had given him everything while demanding sacrifices that most people could never comprehend. He thought about all the birthdays missed, the family gatherings he had skipped for training camps, the relationships that had been strained by the relentless demands of maintaining championship-level performance year after year. His corner team approached cautiously, sensing that something was different about their fighter's demeanor. They had been with Manny through countless victories and defeats, but they had never seen him struggle to compose himself after a win. The usual post-fight routine of celebration and media obligations felt inappropriate given the emotional state they were witnessing. His longtime trainer exchanged concerned glances with his manager, both recognizing that this moment required sensitivity and patience rather than the typical rush to capitalize on victory momentum. The arena was slowly emptying as casual fans began making their way to the exits, but the hardcore boxing enthusiasts remained in their seats, sensing that something significant was happening. The energy in the building had shifted from celebration to anticipation, as if everyone present understood they were witnessing something unprecedented. The usual post-fight chaos of interviews and photo opportunities was being replaced by an almost reverent atmosphere. Manny's mind drifted to his childhood in the Philippines, to the poverty that had driven him to boxing in the first place. He remembered the hunger, not just for success, but literal hunger that had motivated every early morning training session and every painful sparring round. The boy who had started this journey could never have imagined the weight of expectation that would come with achieving his wildest dreams. Success had brought responsibilities he had never anticipated, transforming him from a fighter into a symbol, a representative of hope for millions of people who saw their own struggles reflected in his story. The emotional dam that had been building throughout his career was beginning to crack. Years of maintaining a public persona, of being strong for everyone who depended on him, of carrying the hopes and dreams of an entire nation, had created an internal pressure that was finally reaching its breaking point. The 70th victory had become a catalyst for emotions that had been suppressed for decades. Television producers were growing impatient, aware that broadcast schedules needed to be maintained and that millions of viewers were waiting for the post-fight interview. But Manny's team formed a protective circle around him, buying time while their fighter struggled to regain his composure. They understood that whatever was happening transcended the usual business of boxing promotion and required a different kind of handling. The moment of truth was approaching rapidly, and everyone in the arena could sense that when Manny finally stepped up to those microphones, the world was about to hear something they had never heard before. The television cameras remained focused on Manny as he slowly made his way toward the interview area, each step feeling heavier than the last. The bright lights that had illuminated countless post-fight interviews throughout his career now felt harsh and unforgiving, exposing every emotion that flickered across his weathered face. The boxing gloves had been removed from his hands, but the weight of what those hands had accomplished over 2 decades felt more present than ever before. As he approached the microphones, Manny could feel the eyes of the world upon him. The arena had grown quieter, with even the most boisterous fans sensing that something extraordinary was about to unfold. The usual post-fight energy of celebration and analysis had been replaced by an almost sacred atmosphere, as if everyone present understood they were about to witness a moment that would transcend sports and enter the realm of pure human emotion. The interviewer, a seasoned sports journalist who had covered hundreds of boxing matches, immediately recognized that this would not be a typical post-fight conversation. Manny's body language spoke of exhaustion that went far beyond physical fatigue. This was the weariness of a man who had carried the weight of expectations, dreams, and responsibilities for longer than most people could imagine. The professional smile that usually accompanied victory celebrations was nowhere to be found, replaced by an expression of profound contemplation and barely contained emotion. Standing before the microphones, Manny felt the full force of his journey washing over him in waves. The 70 victories represented more than just wins and losses. They were markers of time, sacrifice, and transformation that had shaped not just his career, but his entire identity. He thought about the young man who had first stepped into professional boxing rings with nothing but raw talent and desperate hunger, and how that person had evolved into someone who carried the hopes of millions on his shoulders. The weight of representing the Philippines had always been both an honor and a burden that Manny had carried with pride. But in this moment, he felt the full magnitude of that responsibility. Every fight had been more than just a personal challenge. It had been a chance to bring joy, hope, and inspiration to people who saw their own struggles reflected in his journey from poverty to greatness. The pressure of never wanting to disappoint those who believed in him had been a constant companion throughout his career. His mind wandered to the countless training camps, the months spent away from family, the physical punishment his body had endured in pursuit of excellence. The price of greatness had been paid in increments over decades, but standing here after his 70th victory, the total cost was becoming clear in a way it never had before. Every championship belt, every record broken, every milestone achieved had required pieces of himself that could never be recovered. The interviewer began to speak, but Manny found himself struggling to focus on the questions being asked. The emotions that had been building throughout the fight were now threatening to overwhelm him completely. His breathing became more labored, not from physical exertion, but from the effort required to maintain composure in front of millions of viewers who expected strength and confidence from their champion. The arena fell into an expectant hush as Manny stepped closer to the microphones. His hands, which had delivered thousands of punches with precision and power, now trembled slightly as he prepared to speak. The moment had arrived when years of suppressed emotion, sacrifice, and reflection would finally find their voice. The world was about to hear something that would change how they understood not just Manny Pacquiao the fighter, but Manny Pacquiao the human being. What happened next would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. The first words that escaped Manny's lips were barely audible, a whispered acknowledgement of gratitude that seemed to come from the deepest part of his soul. As he began to speak, his voice carried a tremor that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion and everything to do with the emotional earthquake occurring within him. The seasoned champion, who had faced the world's best fighters without flinching, was now struggling to maintain his composure in front of a microphone. The tears began slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, gathering at the corners of his eyes before spilling over onto his cheeks. The sight of Manny Pacquiao crying after a victory sent shockwaves through the arena and into the homes of millions of viewers worldwide. This wasn't the controlled emotion of a grateful winner or the relief of someone who had overcome adversity. This was something much deeper and more profound, the release of decades of accumulated pressure and sacrifice. As the tears flowed more freely, Manny's words began to pour out with them, creating a stream of consciousness that revealed the true cost of his extraordinary career. He spoke about the loneliness that had accompanied his success, the isolation that came with being elevated to legendary status while still feeling like the scared young man from General Santos City who had first stepped into a boxing ring out of desperation rather than ambition. The gap between public perception and private reality had created a chasm that had grown wider with each victory. The interviewer and camera crew found themselves witnessing something unprecedented in sports broadcasting. This wasn't a planned emotional moment or a calculated display of vulnerability. This was raw, unfiltered human emotion breaking through the carefully constructed facade that professional athletes are trained to maintain. The usual questions about fight strategy and future plans seemed trivial in the face of what was unfolding before them. Manny's words revealed the profound weight of carrying an entire nation's hopes and dreams. He described the pressure of knowing that his performance in the ring could affect the mood of millions of people, that his victories brought joy to those struggling with poverty and hardship, while his defeats could plunge entire communities into despair. The responsibility of being a symbol rather than just an athlete had been a burden he had carried silently for years. The emotional breakdown continued as Manny reflected on the relationships that had been strained by his dedication to boxing. He spoke about missing crucial moments in his children's lives, about the guilt that accompanied every training camp that took him away from family, about the way his pursuit of greatness had sometimes made him feel like a stranger in his own home. The price of excellence had been measured not just in physical punishment, but in lost time and missed connections. His voice cracked as he addressed the fans who had supported him throughout his journey, expressing gratitude while simultaneously revealing the overwhelming pressure their love and expectations had created. The knowledge that so many people depended on him for inspiration and hope had been both a source of strength and a crushing responsibility that had shaped every decision he made, both inside and outside the ring. The arena had fallen completely silent, except for Manny's voice and the quiet sobs that punctuated his words. Even the most hardened boxing journalists found themselves moved by the raw honesty of what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a post-fight interview, it was a confession, a reckoning, and a moment of profound human vulnerability that transcended sports entirely. The cameras continued rolling as Manny's emotional revelation reached its crescendo, capturing every tear, every tremor in his voice, every moment of this unprecedented display of authentic emotion from one of boxing's greatest champions. The emotional floodgates had opened completely now, and Manny found himself sharing thoughts and feelings that he had never articulated before, not even to his closest family members or most trusted advisors. His words came in waves, sometimes rushed and urgent, other times slow and deliberate, as if he was discovering these truths about himself even as he spoke them aloud. The 70 victories had become a mirror reflecting back the entirety of his life's journey, forcing him to confront aspects of his experience that he had long kept buried beneath the demands of maintaining his public image. He began describing the physical toll that decades of elite competition had taken on his body, but more importantly, he revealed the psychological exhaustion that came from constantly having to be strong for everyone else. The expectation that champions should always project confidence and invincibility had prevented him from acknowledging his own moments of doubt, fear, and vulnerability. For the first time in his career, he was admitting that even legends struggle with uncertainty, and that strength sometimes comes from acknowledging weakness rather than hiding it. The tears continued to flow as Manny reflected on the evolution of his relationship with boxing itself. What had begun as a means of survival and escape from poverty had transformed into something much more complex, a source of identity, purpose, and meaning, but also a demanding master that had shaped every aspect of his existence. He spoke about the difficulty of maintaining passion for something that had become both his greatest blessing and his most demanding obligation. His words revealed the internal conflict between gratitude for his success and grief for the parts of himself that had been sacrificed along the way. The young man who had first entered the sport with simple dreams of providing for his family had evolved into a global icon. But that transformation had required leaving behind aspects of his personality and desires that could never be recovered. The price of becoming Manny Pacquiao. The legend had been the gradual disappearance of Manny, the ordinary person. The arena remained in stunned silence as he continued to share his most private thoughts about legacy and mortality. At this stage of his career, he was acutely aware that his time as an active fighter was limited, and the approaching end of his boxing journey was forcing him to confront questions about identity and purpose that extended far beyond the sport. The realization that he would eventually have to exist without the structure and meaning that boxing had provided was both liberating and terrifying. Manny's emotional revelation took an even more personal turn as he addressed the loneliness that had accompanied his success. Despite being surrounded by teams of trainers, managers, and supporters, he described feeling isolated by the unique pressures and experiences that came with his level of achievement. The inability to share certain burdens with others, either because they couldn't understand or because he felt obligated to protect them from his struggles, had created a profound sense of solitude that success had only amplified. The cameras captured every nuance of his breakdown, from the way his hands shook as he wiped away tears to the tremor in his voice as he struggled to find words for emotions that had never been expressed before. This wasn't just a moment of vulnerability, it was a complete dismantling of the protective barriers that had allowed him to function as a public figure while keeping his deepest struggles hidden from view. The interviewer and production crew found themselves in uncharted territory, witnessing something that transcended typical sports coverage and entered the realm of profound human drama. The usual protocols for post-fight interviews seemed inadequate for what was unfolding, requiring them to adapt in real time to capture this unprecedented moment of authentic emotion from one of the world's most recognizable athletes. The emotional intensity in the arena reached a crescendo as Manny's words took on an even more profound and personal dimension. His voice, now hoarse from the combination of physical exertion and emotional strain, carried a weight that seemed to resonate through every corner of the massive venue. The tears that had begun as a trickle were now flowing freely, each drop representing years of suppressed feelings and unspoken truths that were finally finding their way to the surface. As he continued speaking, Manny began to address the spiritual and philosophical questions that his 70th victory had awakened within him. The milestone had forced him to confront the finite nature of his career and, by extension, his own mortality, in a way that previous achievements had not. He spoke about the strange paradox of reaching the pinnacle of success while simultaneously feeling an overwhelming sense of emptiness, as if the very accomplishment he had worked toward for decades had revealed the limitations of external validation in providing lasting fulfillment. The raw honesty of his words was creating ripple effects throughout the boxing world and beyond. Social media platforms were exploding with reactions as clips of his emotional breakdown spread across the internet at lightning speed. Fans, fellow athletes, and celebrities were sharing their own responses to witnessing such unprecedented vulnerability from a figure who had always represented strength and resilience. The moment was transcending sports and becoming a cultural phenomenon that spoke to universal themes of success, sacrifice, and the human condition. Manny's reflection turned to his relationship with his homeland and the complex emotions surrounding his role as a national hero. He described the honor and burden of representing the Philippines on the world stage, acknowledging how his success had become intertwined with the national identity and collective self-esteem of millions of his countrymen. The responsibility of carrying those hopes and dreams had been both a source of motivation and an enormous pressure that had influenced every decision he made throughout his career. The emotional breakdown was revealing layers of complexity that few people had ever suspected existed beneath his public persona. He spoke about the difficulty of maintaining authentic relationships when success had created such a vast distance between his experiences and those of the people around him. The isolation that came with legendary status had been compounded by the need to constantly project strength and confidence, preventing him from seeking the support and understanding that every human being requires. His words began to address the broader implications of his career for the sport of boxing itself. The 70 victories represented not just personal achievement, but a contribution to the rich history and tradition of a sport that had given him everything. He reflected on his responsibility to future generations of fighters, acknowledging how his success had opened doors and created opportunities for others, while also setting standards that might be impossible to replicate. The arena's atmosphere had become almost sacred, with even the most hardened boxing veterans finding themselves moved by the depth of emotion they were witnessing. Camera operators continued to capture every moment, understanding that they were documenting something that would be studied and referenced for decades to come. The usual post-fight celebration had been transformed into something resembling a confession or testimonial that was revealing truths about the cost of greatness that extended far beyond boxing. As Manny's emotional revelation continued, it became clear that this moment was serving as both an ending and a beginning. The 70th victory had become a catalyst for a fundamental shift in how he understood his career, his identity, and his future. The tears were washing away not just the accumulated stress and pressure of decades of competition, but also the protective barriers that had prevented him from fully processing the magnitude of his journey and its impact on every aspect of his life. The emotional catharsis continued to unfold as Manny's words took on an even more intimate and revelatory quality. His breakdown had moved beyond the realm of sports commentary and entered territory that felt deeply personal and universally human. The 70 victories had become a lens through which he was examining not just his career, but the fundamental questions of purpose, meaning, and identity that define every person's existence, regardless of their level of success or recognition. His voice, now barely above a whisper at times, carried the weight of decades of unspoken gratitude toward the people who had believed in him when he was nothing more than a hungry young fighter with impossible dreams. He spoke about his early trainers, the gym owners who had given him opportunities, the promoters who had taken chances on an unknown Filipino boxer, and the countless individuals whose faith and support had made his journey possible. The tears that accompanied these acknowledgements seemed to carry with them years of appreciation that had never been fully expressed. The emotional revelation took on an even more profound dimension as Manny began addressing his own mortality and the legacy he would leave behind. The 70th victory had forced him to confront the reality that his time as an active fighter was drawing to a close, and with it, the identity that had defined him for more than 2 decades. The prospect of life after boxing was both exciting and terrifying, representing freedom from the demands of training and competition, while also requiring him to discover who he was beyond the confines of the ring. His words revealed a deep concern for the impact his career had on his family, particularly his children, who had grown up in the shadow of his fame and success. He expressed regret for the moments he had missed, the conversations that had been postponed for training camps, and the way his pursuit of greatness had sometimes made him feel like a stranger in his own home. The guilt that accompanied these realizations was palpable, adding another layer to the complex emotions that were pouring out of him. The arena remained in complete silence, except for Manny's voice and the occasional sound of his tears hitting the canvas beneath his feet. Even the most experienced sports journalists found themselves struggling to maintain their professional composure as they witnessed this unprecedented display of vulnerability from one of the world's most recognizable athletes. The moment had transcended typical sports coverage and become something resembling a spiritual or therapeutic experience that was affecting everyone present. Manny's emotional breakdown began to address the broader themes of success and happiness, questioning whether the pursuit of greatness had brought him the fulfillment he had expected. He spoke about the strange emptiness that sometimes accompanied his greatest victories, the way achievement could feel hollow when it came at the cost of personal relationships and inner peace. The 70 victories represented the pinnacle of professional success, but they had also highlighted the limitations of external accomplishment in providing lasting satisfaction. His words took on an almost philosophical quality as he reflected on the nature of competition and the drive that had pushed him to continue fighting long after he had achieved financial security and global recognition. The need to prove himself, to test his limits, and to continue growing had become both a blessing and a curse that had shaped every aspect of his existence. The realization that this drive might never be fully satisfied was both liberating and deeply unsettling. The emotional intensity of the moment was creating a ripple effect that extended far beyond the arena. Television networks were extending their coverage, recognizing that they were witnessing something historically significant. The usual post-fight analysis and commentary seemed inadequate for what was unfolding, requiring broadcasters to adapt their approach to capture the full magnitude of this unprecedented moment of human vulnerability and authentic emotion. As Manny's emotional journey reached its culmination, his words began to take on a tone of acceptance and profound gratitude that seemed to emerge from the deepest wells of his being. The tears that had flowed so freely throughout his revelation were now accompanied by something that resembled peace, as if the act of finally expressing these long-suppressed emotions had created space for healing and understanding that had been impossible while they remained hidden beneath the surface. The 70th victory had become more than just a milestone. It had transformed into a moment of reckoning that allowed him to fully appreciate the extraordinary nature of his journey, while also acknowledging its costs. His voice, though still trembling with emotion, carried a newfound clarity as he spoke about the privilege of having lived a life that had touched so many people around the world. The realization that his struggles and triumphs had provided inspiration and hope to millions of individuals facing their own challenges gave deeper meaning to every sacrifice he had made. His emotional breakdown began to shift toward a message of hope and resilience that reflected the very qualities that had made him a champion. Through his tears, he spoke about the importance of perseverance, not just in boxing, but in life itself. The 70 victories represented more than just wins in a sport. They were testament to the power of refusing to surrender in the face of overwhelming odds, of continuing to fight even when success seemed impossible. The arena remained transfixed as Manny's words took on an almost universal quality, speaking to themes that transcended boxing and touched on the fundamental human experience of struggle, growth, and the search for meaning. His vulnerability had created a connection with the audience that went far beyond the typical relationship between athlete and fan, establishing a bond based on shared humanity rather than athletic achievement. As his emotional revelation drew toward its conclusion, Manny began expressing gratitude for the opportunity to have lived such an extraordinary life, despite its challenges and sacrifices. He acknowledged that the path he had chosen was not one that everyone could or should follow, but he expressed hope that his story might encourage others to pursue their own dreams with the same dedication and persistence that had carried him from poverty to global recognition. The tears that had marked the beginning of his breakdown were now accompanied by something that resembled joy, not the explosive celebration typically associated with victory, but a deeper, more profound appreciation for the journey itself. The 70th win had become a catalyst for understanding that success was not just about achieving goals, but about the person he had become through the process of pursuing them. His final words carried a message of love and appreciation for everyone who had supported him throughout his career, from his family and team to the fans who had cheered for him in arenas around the world. The emotional weight of carrying their hopes and dreams had been enormous, but in this moment of complete vulnerability, he was able to express how much their faith and support had meant to him throughout his journey. As Manny stepped back from the microphones, the arena erupted in applause that seemed different from typical post-fight celebrations. This was not just appreciation for athletic achievement, but recognition of the courage it had taken to share such intimate and personal truths with the world. The moment had transcended sports and become something approaching art, a raw, unfiltered expression of human emotion that would be remembered long after the details of the fight itself had faded from memory. The cameras continued rolling as Manny wiped away his final tears, his face now showing a mixture of exhaustion and relief that suggested the emotional journey was complete. The 70th victory would be remembered not just for the boxing achievement it represented, but for the profound moment of human vulnerability and authentic emotion that had followed it. Thank you for watching another episode of Champion Stories. If you enjoyed today's story, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of our upcoming inspiring tales about Manny Pacquiao. Share your thoughts in the comments. We read every single one, and many times your ideas inspire our next episode. See you next time.